Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Having bought a house by the sea, the widower surgeon was stunned to hear the voice of his deceased wife from the attic. And when he climbed upstairs and saw the endless blue sea and the sharp, salty air were somewhat intoxicating, driving away old sadness. Dante wandered along the shore, watching the waves and seagulls. Suddenly, he felt an urge to take off his shoes and run along the shoreline as he did in his childhood. The pebbles, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced his feet, but this pain seemed curative to Dante. It was as if it was cleansing him, making memories fainter and less painful. Before his mind's eye, his wife Elena appeared once more. At first, she was laughing, then sad, and then she said, "Dante, I have cancer." But she no longer blamed him for not saving her, even though he was a top-notch surgeon who had performed many similar operations, most of which were successful. Yet, luck or something else unknown had failed them. Dante didn't know why, but the guilt still gnawed inside him, preventing him from breathing deeply. Sometimes, he felt as if he was no longer living, having died long ago with Elena. One of the stones on the shore was particularly sharp and large. Dante stumbled and fell to one knee. Then he curled up on the stony beach. He couldn't tell if it was the salty water or his own tears that were soaking him. A man crying, how embarrassing. This thought sobered him abruptly, just as the coolness of the encroaching wave did. Dante got up and looked around. It seemed to him that in the distance, there was a slender female figure painfully familiar. He shook his head and the vision vanished. "Elena is dead, and that's just some tourist who thought I needed help," Dante told himself as he left the welcoming shore. He would wander more, breathe in the healing sea salts, because he was going to be here for a while. Dante turned onto a narrow street with small, quaint houses. Here it was April, leaves and flowers were blooming, bees and dragonflies were buzzing around. They flitted around Dante, making him feel as though he was coming back to life. He approached a tree in full bloom near a gate and inhaled the intoxicating scent of flower pollen. The small coastal village made his heart beat again, unlike his gloomy hometown, where he walked as a shadow of his former self. Dante had worked as a surgeon at a clinical hospital for many years. 5 years ago, he lost his wife, who died suddenly of cancer. They had no children, few relatives, and those who lived in the same city only pitied him, deepening his sorrow and hindering the healing of his emotional wounds. During long, lonely nights, Dante initially wallowed in self-pity and reminisced about his wife, but eventually decided to move on. He was just over 30, but already felt like a 70-year-old man, exhausted. Dante realized that to change something, he needed to leave his hometown. For him, the city had become a graveyard of memories. It was where he and Elena had met, where they had married, and where he had held her memorial services. That's when a long-standing desire to move to the sea resurfaced, to a place where it was warm and carefree. Back in his student days, Dante had wanted to work in a clinic in Menorca. Fortunately, he had studied well, completed his residency with distinction, and could choose his future workplace. Such specialists were highly sought after. He imagined coming to an empty beach after a tough night shift and plunging into the sea from the pier, feeling the salty water wash away his fatigue, while the cries of seagulls transported him into a magical meditation. But then Dante met Elena. She was studying art history and couldn't imagine her life without Madrid. So Dante yielded to his beloved. He always became soft and pliable under the warm touch of his wife. Thus, in Madrid, he became a truly top-notch surgeon, while his dream faded into the background of daily concerns and only later resurfaced like a life buoy, pulling him out of depression. He became passionate about the idea of buying a seaside cottage and moving away. Away from the gloomy labyrinths of painful memories. Dante was abruptly jolted from his thoughts when he once again noticed a slender, delicate figure ahead, with light hair and a white dress. "Elena?" he asked softly. Nearby, someone slammed a door. Dante turned toward the sound, and when he looked back at the figure, she was gone. He rubbed his temples and almost ran to his new house, fortunately just around the corner. Unfortunately, even after selling his apartment in central Madrid, he couldn't afford the luxurious mansion he had hoped for. He gave part of the money to his wife's relatives. After all, they had jointly invested in the property, and he didn't feel right keeping all the money for himself. What remained, plus his savings, was enough to buy a small, not-so-new house, but quite sturdy, with a shady garden, a blooming cherry tree, persimmons, and other yet-to-be-identified shrubs and trees. Dante was still a doctor, not a gardener, though it was worth looking into. Lost in thoughts about how to improve the garden, update the gazebo, he was hiding his confusion. He had seen his deceased wife. What did it mean? Had he lost his mind, or was Elena against his decision to start life anew? She had appeared in dreams before, but they were memories, not his real life here and now. Nonsense. Dante began taking out ingredients from the refrigerator. He decided to make dinner. The mechanical actions helped him organize his thoughts. Elena was dead. Dante nervously sliced cucumbers into large rounds on the cutting board. Yes, I feel guilty about her and constantly think about it. Of course, under stress, my imagination might play tricks and turn wishes into reality, but rational arguments and science say that ghosts don't exist. Dante abruptly placed the plates with a light dinner on the table, turned on the TV, and tried to focus on what was happening on the screen. Gradually, his pulse and breathing returned to normal. Dante habitually analyzed his condition and realized he had calmed down. He cleaned up the dishes, lay down on the couch, and tried to get into a new detective series. The characters' dialogues initially engaged him, then lulled him. Dante dozed off and even dreamt of Elena, and suddenly distinctly heard sobs. Children's? He woke up and sat on the couch. With one motion, he turned off the TV and listened to the silence. Was it just his imagination again? Dante loosened the collar of his shirt, which he had worn out of habit. Elena liked it when he dressed up at home. Dante glanced out the window. It was already getting dark outside. There wasn't a soul in sight. It was too early for the tourist crowds, and the locals had long since scattered to their homes. Again, he heard a soft sob and indistinct murmuring. "That's not a child," Dante whispered and ran outside. It seemed to him that the sound was either coming from the street or from the sky. "I'm a rational adult who doesn't believe in ghosts or an afterlife," he quietly reassured himself. He grabbed a lantern from the table on the veranda and set off to check the bushes and undergrowth around the house. He startled the neighbor's cat, frightened himself out of his wits, and leaned against the trunk of a pear tree. He listened intently. The cicadas were chirping, the distant hum of the road was audible, and something else was rustling, possibly the sea, but there were no voices, neither female nor any other kind. Dante peeled himself away from the reassuring tree and looked at his house, its outline faintly visible in the dark. It seemed to him that the house was mocking him. The windows looked like eyes, the light trim of the veranda like a smile, and the small attic window resembled a third eye. Dante smirked at the comparison and suddenly saw a flicker of light in the attic. He felt an urge to cross himself and have a drink. The latter was more appealing. Dante swallowed hard and cautiously approached the house. He opened the door, which creaked loudly. He could no longer hear the cicadas or the sea, the pounding of his heart filled the space. He was scared, probably for the second time in his life after Elena's death. He had always wished for Elena to come back, but not like this, not as a ghost or poltergeist, as they call it. Suddenly, he stubbed his little toe on the corner of the hallway, let out a soft howl, and hopped on one foot. He felt his hands shaking and his legs giving way. "I need a drink," Dante whispered. For some reason, he didn't want to speak loudly. It seemed as though he could be heard, especially since Elena had always been against alcohol. She never drank and discouraged him from doing so. Remembering his wife, Dante cursed again, then with determined steps headed to the buffet, opened a bottle of brandy, he had plenty of it from his time working, and poured himself half a glass. His friend Ernesto would have called this sacrilege against a 5-star esteemed drink, but Dante wasn't in the mood for sentimentality. He downed the brandy in one gulp, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and feeling the warmth in his chest, resolutely made his way to the attic. As he approached the stairs, he heard the female murmuring or wailing again, hiccuped drunkenly, grabbed a leg from the dismantled veranda table just in case, then thought it seemed inappropriate to meet his deceased wife with a stick. He remembered that there were some flowers growing in the garden, but then shook himself out of it and, swaying from the unfamiliarity, clambered up to the attic. The attic hatch creaked in surprise as Dante opened it with one hand. He expected to see a cloud of dust, but the room was surprisingly clean and lived in. In the corner, a night light or candle flickered, and there was a female figure in a light dress. Dante swallowed and, like a puppet, walked towards her, but the closer he got, the more he realized that he was not facing a ghost, and the sleeping girl bore no resemblance to his late wife. She was sobbing and sniffling, muttering, and even cursing in her sleep. Her cheeks had visible bruises, her hands were covered in bruises and scratches, and her knees were scraped and bleeding. The girl was pulling them up, apparently feeling the evening chill. Dante dimmed the lantern and felt uneasy. He sat on the floor and studied the girl carefully, trying to decide what to do with her. Who is she? A stray? An adventurer? A thief? Or perhaps a relative of the former owners? But as far as he understood from the realtor's talk, the house's owner had died long ago. The relatives were only very distant ones. They had been in a lengthy legal battle over the seaside property and had finally sold it and divided the money. Dante stared thoughtfully at the stranger. He noticed that the girl's face was wet with tears, her lips were swollen, and her eyes were too. Maybe someone hurt her or was chasing her, he suddenly thought, feeling sympathy. The girl woke up from his intense gaze. She blinked sleepily and looked directly at Dante, and he felt as though the air in his lungs had vanished. Her eyes, they were as blue as Elena's, the color of heavenly violets with the veil of spring rain. All words flew out of his head, and once again, thoughts of ghosts and nightmares surfaced. I'm leaving now, the girl suddenly jumped up. This house used to be vacant. Are you the new owner, or? She fell silent and looked at Dante fearfully. She must have smelled the alcohol, he realized with guilt. My name is Dante. I am indeed the owner of the house, and I'm a doctor. He raised both hands to show that he posed no threat to the girl. At the same time, he was scrutinizing her carefully. Who knows, she might still be a thief or something worse, and so she fell asleep at the scene of the crime, he mused to himself, taking a few steps back to clear the attic hatch. Let's go down to the kitchen. I'll examine you, and you can tell me what you're doing here, Dante said firmly. The stranger flinched, hugged herself, and cautiously descended, constantly glancing around. Dante followed every step she took. She passed by the front door and didn't attempt to flee, nor did she grab the poker or axe that had always stood in the corner since the move. Maybe I should build a little bathhouse, he suddenly remembered dreamily, relaxing a bit. Probably too much, because the uninvited guest approached the kitchen table and picked up the knife Dante had recently used to cut bread. I don't want to attack you, but if you overstep, I'll be able to defend myself. Dante raised both hands again and sat on the armrest of the sofa. Let me remind you that you broke into my house. I know, but the house has always been vacant, the girl said softly. I have nowhere else to go. My stepfather drinks and is abusive. My mother used to stop him, but she died a year ago. The whole village knows about it. The stranger's lip trembled, and she bit it, while the knife in her hand shook so much that Dante worried she might cut herself. There's a cabinet behind you. In the drawer are my passport, house documents, and my workbook. I'm a surgeon, and I can examine you. Did your stepfather beat you? The girl sobbed again, backed up to the indicated cabinet, and carefully retrieved the documents. Everything matched, the address in the documents, the photo in the passport, and Dante being a doctor. The girl's tears flowed more fiercely down her cheeks, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She struggled to put the documents and knife back in place. Will you turn me into the police? She asked quietly, hugging herself again. Dante took out a first aid kit, pulled out a sedative, and handed it to her. She swallowed it wordlessly and watched intently as Dante retrieved bandages and antiseptic. "My name is Giovanna. I live with my stepfather on the next street and work at a cafe on the beach." Dante silently gestured for her to sit on a chair and began treating the abrasions on her face. Giovanna remained silent, not interfering with his work. "Does your stepfather beat you often?" Dante asked cautiously as he finished with her face and moved on to her hands. "He didn't drink or hit me before. After my mother died, he lost control. He started drinking heavily, quit his job, and got involved in dubious activities." Giovanna winced quietly when he touched the deepest abrasion. "Now you need to endure a little longer." "If it were any deeper, I'd have to stitch it," Dante hissed through his teeth. "Thank you," she looked into his eyes. "There's no special credit to me here. I just treated your wounds. Thank you for not calling the police." Dante gave a crooked smile. "Well, we're sort of neighbors, so consider it a neighborly favor." The man put away all the supplies and tools in the first aid kit, and an awkward silence filled the kitchen. It was broken by Giovanna, who abruptly stood up from the chair and unconsciously wiped her hands on her dress. "Well, should I go now?" "Go ahead," Dante said, not wanting to keep the guest any longer. He was already feeling somewhat burdened by the girl's presence. He wanted to be alone to think about the whole situation and to collect his thoughts. The effects of the alcohol were fading, and his head began to ache. Dante grimaced. He must be getting older. Giovanna walked out the door and turned back before the gate. "I work as a waitress at Breeze Cafe. Come by sometime. The food is good and affordable." Dante nodded politely and closed the door. The house still carried the smell of peroxide and a faint trace of the girl's scent. Memories of the ghost of his wife returned, making him feel as though he had somehow betrayed her. "What nonsense," Dante muttered, took an aspirin, and, flipping on the remote, stretched out on the sofa. Within a few minutes, he fell asleep, exhausted by his thoughts. "I'll just return her personal items," Dante reassured himself as he scanned the beach for the Breeze sign. He couldn't find it anywhere. Annoyed, he frowned and abruptly stopped. A skinny young man ran into him at full speed. "Hey, kid, where's Breeze Cafe?" "It's behind the Float restaurant. It's a low building with no sign." "Dad," Dante thought, feeling a bit irked. He thanked the young man and, clutching the bag of items, headed toward Breeze. Why did everyone hint at his age? He was only 33, not 50 or 60, and he still felt like a young man, or at least a young adult. With these thoughts, he reached the old building. Dante wondered if Giovanna worked in a dive and tensed up internally. Maybe she drank herself and got beaten up by drinking buddies? "I should change the locks and call the police next time," a thought flashed through his mind. But upon entering the building, Dante was greeted by the smell of delicious food. Even his stomach growled in response. Breeze Cafe turned out to be a cozy, modest place with only one waitress and apparently no alcohol, as Dante didn't see any drunk patrons. He sat at a table, and Giovanna quickly came over with the menu. She looked up with her blue eyes and suddenly recognized the owner of the house where she had been hiding. She gasped and offered to treat the guest on the house. "No need," Dante replied, trying not to think about how his wife had the same color eyes. "I just brought the items you left in the attic." Giovanna nodded and quickly began bringing the ordered dishes. Then she took the rustling bag from Dante. The girl was very embarrassed, so he didn't ask her any questions, just ate his meal and left. From that day on, Dante became a regular at the small cafe. After all, he wasn't very good at cooking himself, and there was little point in doing it when living alone. Dante quickly got bored and started to feel restless. "What should I do?" he pondered as he walked into Breeze for dinner. Nobody approached him for a while, so he went to the counter and asked, "Where's Giovanna?" "The waitress?" "She's ill," the cook grumbled curtly. He served Dante his dinner, and after eating, Dante went for a walk along the waterfront. He had a nagging bad feeling inside. He remembered Giovanna's stepfather, who liked to throw his weight around. His feet carried him to the neighboring street. He walked around but couldn't figure out which house the girl lived in. Everything was quiet, and the houses all looked equally well kept. Feeling upset, Dante went home and saw Giovanna standing by the gate, leaning against the fence. His heart raced with concern. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Giovanna flinched and pushed her hair away from her face. This time, her stepfather had really gone to town. It was hard to recognize her due to the bruises and contusions. Dante muttered a curse and let the accidental acquaintance inside. "Maybe you should go to the police?" he asked, trying to give first aid. "Although you should have gone to the emergency room." "It's useless, I've already reported it," the girl sniffled. "They call my stepfather because of my report, but then they let him go home, where he takes revenge on me for complaining to the police." Giovanna suddenly burst into tears, and Dante was at a loss. How could he comfort her? He awkwardly embraced the girl and stroked her head, feeling the faint scent and silky hair. He swallowed hard and pulled away. For some reason, Giovanna evoked feelings in him that were far from paternal, even though she was probably much younger. "How old are you?" Dante asked unexpectedly. 22, the girl sniffled. "I'm of legal age and independent." He smiled at her bravado. "I have a proposition for you as an independent young woman." Giovanna looked up at him again with her big blue eyes. Her breath caught unexpectedly. "I have a summer house. I was just planning to tidy it up. You could live there." The girl looked at him warily, and Dante thought she even shivered a bit. "But it's not free," he suddenly added. "In exchange, I'd ask you to clean the house. And cook occasionally. I don't really enjoy dealing with food myself." Giovanna remained silent, adjusting the folds of her skirt. "I promise not to touch you or report you to your stepfather. And the neighbors won't know about you either," Dante added, not understanding why the girl seemed unhappy with his offer. And suddenly the girl blurted out, "I won't sleep with you." She blushed deeply and hid her face in her hands. "I see the way you look at me." Dante suddenly softened. He really liked the idea of helping the girl. Besides, living alone had become quite burdensome. Calling relatives would mean constant reminders of Elena, but here was an unfamiliar person in a separate house with no claims on his emotional peace. "Your eyes are very similar to my wife's eyes." "Oh," the girl was surprised. "Sorry, I thought you weren't married." "I'm a widower," Dante said, immediately regretting it as he saw the sympathy in Giovanna's eyes. "My wife died 5 years ago, and I quit my job and bought this little house." They fell silent. Dante thought again about Elena, while Giovanna seemed lost in her own thoughts. "All right. I agree," the girl said quietly. "I'll keep working at Breeze until the bruises heal. And I'll help you. I'll manage everything, don't worry." Then she fell silent, as if gathering her thoughts. "And if possible, can I move in today and go straight to the summer house?" "But it's a complete mess there," Dante was surprised. "That's okay," Giovanna said bravely. "I'm quick. I'll clean up fast and won't make noise. I just need some rags and buckets. And show me where I can get water." Dante looked skeptically at the girl, who resembled a little battle sparrow with bright blue eyes. He suddenly realized that she was dispelling his gloom and energizing him, and she was nothing like the calm and composed Elena. In the evening, Dante saw from his window that the windows of the summer house were lit up, and in the bright light, he could see the slender figure of the girl. It warmed his heart, and she had managed everything's tidying up, fetching her belongings, and even preparing dinner. Dante held a mug of hot, aromatic coffee and thought that life was getting better. Thus ended the spring and the hot southern summer began. Dante renovated the summer house and built a sturdy wooden gazebo from scratch. He didn't bother fixing the old junk that was already on the property. His house unexpectedly started to have cozy items. There was a soft blanket on the sofa, a tablecloth on the table, and a magnet with a grocery list on the fridge. He and Giovanna had grown accustomed to each other. They didn't communicate often, but even in silence, it was pleasant for Dante to be with her. They were sitting together in the evening darkness of the southern night. It was late dinner time. Dante should have gone to rest, but for some reason, he stayed. He enjoyed watching Giovanna clear the table. Her lithe figure flickered in the doorway of the house and then returned to the gazebo. He was tempted to help, but the girl gently pushed him away. Now, Dante felt warmed by her touch, and he felt wrapped in a sense of comfort. "And I hardly remember her," Dante suddenly blurted out. "Tell me about your wife." Giovanna froze and looked at him with her blue eyes, which were not filled with pity, otherwise he would have shut down and retreated into his house to escape the sentimental conversation. Giovanna was genuinely interested in his story. Her gaze showed concern, and Dante sighed and began to talk. Her name was Elena. We got married after we finished university. She studied art history. She loved museums and could spend hours discussing the spectral analysis of a new masterpiece. Dante leaned back in his wicker chair and smiled at his memories. We had a quiet and simple wedding at the Central Registry office. She wore a strict white dress. No ruffles or flowers. She was always a stern and aristocratic lady, always keeping me on my toes, demanding both of herself and of me. She was constantly learning, studying, improving her qualifications, spending time in dusty archives and damp cellars, striving to be the best, and even postponed having children for this reason. Dante fell silent and stared into the impenetrable darkness of the night. Giovanna had already sat down opposite him and did not disturb his confession. Given his mood, it felt like a confession. I really wanted children. 6 years after our wedding, I made it clear that we needed a child. Elena asked me to wait, resisted, but eventually gave in. When she went to my acquaintance, a gynecologist, it turned out she had gynecological issues. She started treatment, but nothing helped, and eventually a benign tumor unexpectedly turned malignant. I volunteered to perform the surgery, although I rarely took on such complex cases. But I did operate on oncology cases frequently. Dante exhaled and rubbed his eyes. The surgery didn't go well, or maybe Elena had already given up the fight. She never wanted children. It scared her, and I pushed her, so I still consider myself at fault. The silence that followed was broken by Giovanna. She quietly said, "But she had a choice. She could have just left. It's strange to blame yourself for someone else's choice." Dante suddenly stood up, almost overturning the table, and looked sharply at Giovanna, who flinched and covered her head with her hands. This gesture cooled Dante. He had evidently reminded the girl of her stepfather. "What's wrong? I would never hit you." He reached out to Giovanna and then pulled back. "Sorry," he threw over his shoulder and disappeared into the house. In the morning, Dante was tormented by feelings of guilt. He went to the summer house with the intention of apologizing to Giovanna, but she wasn't home. He remembered that she worked at Breeze in the morning. After wasting some time waiting for lunch, Dante decided to take a walk along the shore and stop by her workplace. Within an hour, he briskly climbed the steps of Breeze, looked around, and noticed the cook at the serving counter. "Where's Giovanna?" he asked. "Her stepfather came and took her away. He's completely lost it. At least there weren't many customers at the time." Dante's heart sank. I couldn't even protect her, he thought, and he dashed out of the cafe. He only came to his senses as he was running toward Giovanna's house. Several police cars were parked outside. 3 resisting men were being led away by the officers. The whole house was lit up, and things were scattered everywhere. Dante scanned for the familiar silhouette of the girl, but only saw 2 drunken women of dubious freshness leaving the house. A real criminal den, Dante muttered and approached a police officer who was silently observing the scene. "Hello. I'm looking for the stepdaughter of the owner of this house, Giovanna." The police officer thought for a moment, asked why she was needed, and then shrugged, saying he hadn't seen any stepdaughters, she wasn't involved in the case, and there were no reports from her. Dante was about to insist and persuade the officer to look for the girl, but suddenly fatigue and despair hit him. He needed to get home and think about where to search for his temporary neighbor. Dante limped back to his house, hoping to see a light in the summer house, but it was dark. He went inside, took off his shoes, and froze. He could hear faint sobs coming from the attic. He smiled with relief and quickly climbed the attic stairs. Indeed, in the same corner where she had sat a couple of months ago, Giovanna was sitting. "Why are you here?" Dante asked, looking her over. "Seems like there are no serious injuries," he noted to himself, trying not to scare the girl who was clearly in a state of shock. Giovanna tried to speak but started gasping from her sobs. Dante rushed to her and picked her up. She urgently needed a sedative. He quickly administered an injection downstairs while Giovanna was having a hysterical fit. Dante stroked her hair and tried to calm her, while she clung to him and tried to say something. "They're looking for me. They'll put me in jail." Dante rocked her until the sedative took effect and she just fell asleep. Then he sat by her side for a long time, holding her hand while she slept. Giovanna sobbed in her sleep and clung to him. Soon, Dante himself was overcome by sleep. He fell asleep right next to her and woke up to a gentle touch. Opening his eyes, he saw Giovanna and smiled. "Good morning." The girl blushed and jumped up. "I need to leave urgently." "Where to?" Dante, also getting up from the couch and shaking his head to wake up, asked, confused. "My stepfather said that the police are looking for me too." She turned and walked out of the house. Dante stood for a moment, regaining his composure, sighed, and muttered, "Oh, these women." He ran into the summer house and stopped the girl's frantic packing. "Where did you get that idea?" "My stepfather told me when he brought me here. He said I'm wanted and need to sell my share of the house urgently. He's already found buyers, and then the cops showed up, everyone scattered, and I slipped out through the window and across the yard." "And weren't you surprised that no one chased after you?" Dante asked with a smile. "But I'm quick, I guess they didn't notice me," the girl said uncertainly. "My stepfather tricked me, didn't he?" Giovanna guessed and sat on the bed. "Yes," Dante confirmed. "He probably knew he would be arrested any day now. He wanted to sell the house quickly and leave you with nothing." "But how can we know for sure?" The girl frowned. "I asked the police if they were looking for you. They said they had no such task." Giovanna exhaled and suddenly looked at Dante with her cornflower blue eyes. "Did you look for me?" Dante sat next to her and unexpectedly hugged her, burying his chin in her soft hair. "I was very scared when I couldn't find you at the cafe, and the cook said your stepfather had taken you. And you know what else I think?" "What?" The girl looked at Dante attentively. "That everything will be okay with us," he smiled and kissed her on the forehead. Giovanna froze but did not pull away, and they settled into each other's embrace. For the first time, Dante was experiencing autumn not in Madrid but by the warm sea. But it wasn't just the unusually hot September that delighted him, it was also the upcoming date with the girl of his dreams. That's how he mentally referred to his neighbor, who accepted his courtship but kept him at a distance. Dante really wanted a new phase in their relationship. Giovanna wasn't just someone he liked. She helped him believe that he could have a future as well. Yes, he remembered his deceased wife and always would, but he was only 33, which meant he could still be happy. Although at first, he mentally sought forgiveness from Elena and felt guilty, he now understood that he couldn't cling to the past. He needed to move forward, and that step would be getting closer to Giovanna. Dante was sure that this feeling in his heart was growing stronger every day, so he bought flowers, a gift, ordered dinner from a local restaurant, and remained mysteriously silent all day, having previously invited his lady of the heart to an evening date in the twilight of their gazebo. Giovanna blushed charmingly and smiled shyly, which filled Dante's soul with even more warmth. He was confident that everything was going well. They were two wounded souls who had found each other to heal and find happiness. Finally, the sun began to set. Dante picked up the order from the restaurant, set the table, put on his favorite shirt and bow tie, and waited for Giovanna in the gazebo. The girl arrived 15 minutes late. Her fingers were trembling, and her cheeks were flushed with a feverish blush. "It seems I overdid it with the mystery," Dante muttered, hugging Giovanna and warming her hands. She pressed against him, and it was clear that she was very nervous. "I just wanted to give us a celebration," he said, looking at Giovanna with a bit of confusion. "Yes, I'm very grateful to you," the girl said softly. "It's just that no one has ever asked me out on a date, so I don't even know what to do. I think I was supposed to be late, right?" Dante chuckled softly, pulled out a chair for her, and seated her at the table. "Of course. And now you must try these delicious dishes and praise the chef. And the man who organized this surprise for you. I'm already impressed." Giovanna played along and smiled shyly. They had dinner and talked. It was cozy and heartfelt. They didn't have wine since Giovanna didn't like alcohol. After all, having a drinking stepfather who regularly lashed out was a negative experience for a lifetime. But Giovanna gradually relaxed, and Dante felt her mood and also mentally let out a sigh of relief. Dessert was eaten, and Dante hesitated to take the next step. "I think I should go to bed," Giovanna said as she started to get up from the table. "Wait," Dante jumped up. "I have a gift and a request for you." The girl sat back down and looked at him with surprise. Dante walked around the table, knelt down, presented a case with a gold ring, and began his prepared speech. "Giovanna, I met you only 6 months ago, but even now I feel that you are very dear to me." Dante hesitated, couldn't find the right words, and fell silent. Then he got up from his knee, lifted the girl, sat back in the chair, and placed her on his lap. "I might have overdone the formal part, didn't I?" Giovanna smiled and nodded. "Then let's redo it." Dante took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. "Well, it fits." He kissed her hand, which made her cheeks flush even more. "This is to show that you are very dear to me. I know it's been a short time, but I would really like us to try being together." Giovanna pondered and cautiously asked, "What does being together mean?" Dante embraced her. "It means falling asleep and waking up together, making breakfasts, dinners, and lunches, getting a cat, sharing sorrows and joys. And everything that comes with that." Dante kissed Giovanna on the neck, then suddenly stopped. "Sorry, I got carried away. Or do you have no objections?" Giovanna had hundreds of questions. Did he love her seriously? What was their future? And would they be happy? But she simply smiled at her beloved man and leaned in for their first serious kiss. Now everything would be real, and they would fall asleep and wake up together. As for what would happen next? That thought immediately left Giovanna's mind after the passionate kisses. A year passed. Dante was running around their house, tripping over a scared kitten that Giovanna had brought a couple of weeks ago. "My passport. Where's my passport?" Giovanna smiled, calmly walked to her bag, and pulled out a packet of documents. "You've already gathered all the documents. Why are you so worried?" Dante sat down on a chair and exhaled. "You understand how important this trip is for us. After all, to open a new cafe and do everything right, we need money. My savings won't be enough, and I hope Ernesto will invest in our venture so we can finally build a decent house. And generally feel better, so I won't have to work at the hospital anymore." Giovanna approached him and embraced him. "We're doing fine already. And by the way, we've discussed this many, many times. Calm down. Everything will go perfectly, and Bonita and I will wait for you." The kitten heard its name and ran to its bowl. "He thinks you called him for lunch," Dante laughed, feeling his anxiety fade into the background. He now had his own little family, who loved him simply for being who he was. Despite everything, he really didn't want to return to Grey Madrid. Though the weather in their village wasn't great either. Dante grimaced. What's wrong? Giovanna asked, noticing his reaction. I was just imagining what it would be like to fall asleep and wake up without you. Giovanna smiled at the joke, and a taxi honked outside. You should go, the girl said, escorting Dante to the car. She stood on the road for a long time, with a bad premonition tightening her heart. She shivered and went back inside, where the hungry kitten greeted her joyfully. He'll definitely come back to us, won't he, Bonita? The kitten meowed in agreement and eagerly began nibbling on its dry food. Dante landed in Madrid and immediately called his old friend. They had been together since school, although they now communicated much less often, but he still considered Ernesto his best friend. Oh, Dante, you've already arrived? He heard Ernesto's voice. Yes, where shall we meet? I'm here for a short time. They decided to meet in a restaurant in the center a couple of hours later. Dante arrived first and soon met Ernesto. They shook hands firmly and hugged. So, who do you want to open your restaurant with? Ernesto asked after ordering food and reminiscing about a few shared memories. With a girl, my girl, Dante replied firmly. Wow, you have a girlfriend now? What about Elena? His friend suddenly asked. You can't have forgotten her? It's been almost 6 years, Dante interrupted curtly, remembering how much Ernesto had liked his late wife and had even been jealous of her a few times. So, will you help? Ernesto fell silent and threw a crumpled napkin onto the table. Not right now. Business isn't going smoothly, so I can't pull out any money at the moment. Maybe closer to summer. You can start, and I'll join later. Dante looked at his friend closely and realized that, despite their closeness, Ernesto had not supported him either after Elena's death or now. Maybe their friendship was a thing of the past. Fine, if not now, then later. Dante closed the topic and shifted the conversation to mutual acquaintances. An hour later, as they were saying goodbye, Ernesto asked, Are you going to visit Elena's grave? I've already been, Dante answered curtly. My flight back is soon. Well, as you wish, Ernesto grunted. Expect me in the summer. You could introduce me to your girlfriend then. Of course, Dante said, forcing a smile, while privately wishing Ernesto a vacation in Turkey or somewhere far away. Dante left the restaurant, waved goodbye to his friend, and started walking through the streets of Madrid. He had checked his bag with documents and belongings into the airport storage, so he could stroll around the city and indulge in some nostalgia. Suddenly, Dante remembered his only relative, Aunt Ramona, who lived alone and was seriously ill. I should visit her before I leave, he thought, and maybe buy some treats. As far as he remembered, she liked chocolate candies. Dante pondered which store he might visit on his way. He quickly took out his phone to dial Aunt Ramona's number when he heard the screech of brakes. The last thing he remembered was a huge SUV speeding directly at him. Giovanna watched the sunset and thought about Dante. He had left almost 2 weeks ago. He promised he would return the next day, but for some reason, he hadn't come back. His phone was out of service. The girl regularly checked the news and looked at crime reports, trying to find any information, but Madrid was a big city with so many men who died or went missing every day that it made her hair stand on end. It was terrifying for a girl who had lived her whole life in a small seaside village. Giovanna rubbed her belly and spoke soothingly to her unborn child. He's fine, little one, don't worry. He'll be back soon and will be very happy to see you. The girl held on. She was used to life's blows and could stand up for both herself and her future child. Even if her heart ached and her mind coldly asserted, he didn't promise you anything, so he might not come back. Senor Dante, what have you done? A pretty nurse rushed to him, whom he did not remember at all, although he tried very hard to recall the corridors, his old friend who pulled him from the brink, and his former colleagues. He strained his memory so much that his vision started to blur. The nurse, who introduced herself as Lillian, scolded Dante for this, insisting that he take his medications and rest more. He lay on his right side, then his left, and then he grew tired of lying that way, as his mind was blank and demanded to be filled with new knowledge, which was waiting for Dante just outside the ward door. After a hearty lunch and Lillian's instructions, he decided to visit his friend's office. His friend was named Tonio. He was friendly and talked a lot about Dante's past. When Dante was hit by the car, he ended up in the ambulance without any documents or phone. It seemed that his phone was left lying on the asphalt, severing the thread that might have revealed his identity. On the operating table, Dante was in a nearly hopeless state, and it turned out that Tonio, who happened to be on duty that day, immediately recognized Dante and did everything possible and impossible for him. Several surgeries, weeks in intensive care in critical condition, followed by clinical death and a coma. He had been in a coma for a long 6 months, and now he could not remember anything from his past life. At first, it was difficult even to hold a spoon and eat on his own, but he would have been discharged from the hospital and sent to relatives long ago if it hadn't been for his friend and his understanding that Dante needed serious rehabilitation. However, for some reason, he had no money, although his friend said that he had sold his apartment and gone somewhere. Where did his money go? Where had he been? What had happened, he couldn't remember. Although he had a vague feeling that going to his relatives was definitely not a good idea. Moreover, Tonio said that they weren't even his relatives, but close to his deceased wife. Yes, it turned out that Dante was married, but he didn't remember his wife either, which frustrated him. It also seemed to hinder his recovery because every attempt to extract anything from the depths of his murky memory was met with headaches and fatigue. "Hi, Tonio." Dante entered his friend's office and shook his hand. Tonio patted him on the shoulder and looked closely at his face. "Hi, are you tired of lying down?" Dante hesitated. "I don't want to occupy the ward anymore. I'm feeling better, and I can continue the necessary therapy at home." Tonio looked at his friend thoughtfully and nodded slowly. "Today I called Aunt Ramona. She's your mother's sister. She said she wouldn't mind if you went to stay with her after leaving the hospital. Aunt Ramona is elderly and ill, but she has a 3-room apartment in the center, right next to our hospital. It will be comfortable for you there, and our nurses can come by to give you injections and check your condition. I'll also be visiting, and I really can't keep the ward any longer." Dante hugged Tonio and thanked him sincerely. "I'm in your debt." "Oh, don't mention it. You also patched me up after a fight, although you don't remember it, but I'm telling you for sure. We're even." They chatted a bit more, hugged again, and Dante went to pack his things. By evening, he stood in Aunt Ramona's apartment, watching the twilight settle over the city. It was August. The nights were no longer like the days, but they weren't as dark as in the south. A memory scratched at Dante's mind, but he couldn't grasp it before Aunt Ramona's voice came from behind him. "Darling, don't stand by the window. You'll catch a draft. Come on, I found some photos of your mom and dad. The doctor said you need help to recover your memory." Dante nodded and walked into the living room with its high ceilings. It was warm and cozy there. He intuitively felt that Aunt Ramona was a close person to him and that this apartment was almost like home. So the days of his rehabilitation flowed on. Memories reluctantly filled Dante's inner emptiness drop by drop, but the encroaching autumn, dampness, and a sense of hopelessness weighed on him and made it hard to breathe fully, as if something was missing. "Maybe I jumped in front of the car myself," Dante thought sadly. "After all, why did I step into the red light?" The driver received a fine and some not too serious punishment. Dante also paid a fine, which was deducted from his accounts. Witnesses said he was just looking at his phone and didn't notice the traffic light. It was all very strange. He felt a heaviness inside that wouldn't let him rest. He had already met with his wife's relatives, who looked at him gloomily and somehow accusingly, as if he had run someone over, not the other way around. Dante visited his wife's grave. He vaguely remembered her, but realized that he no longer loved Elena. It was as if some other feeling had replaced his attachment to his deceased wife. Yes, he felt gratitude, sadness, and warmth at the sound of her name, but he didn't feel love. Elena's relatives said that he couldn't save his wife because of the surgery, and she died afterward. But Dante didn't feel guilty. Either they were wrong, or that feeling had also long since burned out. Or maybe too many years had passed, Dante thought. He restored his documents and discovered that he had a small house on the coast of Minorca in some tiny village whose name he constantly forgot. Dante called Tonio. "Hi, friend. Want to go to Minorca?" "I'd like to, but it's too early for you to fly. Let's go next fall. It'll be the velvet season, dark nights, hot beauties, and we'll be among all that blooming scenery." Dante smirked. "I suspect that in this tiny village, the only hot things are the grilled sausages on the beach, and for the local beauties, will be nothing but smooth-faced kids." Tonio burst into laughter. "You really know how to spoil the mood. So what are you going to do?" "I wanted to take a look at my little seaside house. But if you say it's too early to go, is your offer to help with the archives still valid?" "You wound me," Tonio laughed heartily. "The stacks of dusty papers are dreaming of being in your hands." They said their warm goodbyes, and the next day Dante was sorting through documents in the archive. It wasn't the best job for an experienced surgeon, but given his memory and health issues, it was the only work he could manage for now. Staying at home was unbearable. Plus, Aunt Ramona herself was tired of his company. He sensed that the elderly woman was used to solitude and breathed a sigh of relief when he left for work in the morning. Dante had almost remembered all his colleagues. They frequently visited him in the archive to share news or gossip. Or, like Lillian, to try to woo the young widower. Dante just smiled when he saw that every day Lillian's nurse's robe seemed to get shorter and shorter, and the top buttons had long forgotten when they were last fastened. He might have responded to the nurse's direct advances, but something held him back. He couldn't pinpoint what it was, but he intuitively felt the need to go to his seaside house. What awaited him there? Dante would find out soon, as a year had flown by with work and daily concerns, and it was now time for their vacation. He and Tonio landed at the airport, picked up their luggage, and breathed in the salty air of freedom. "Do you smell how wonderful our vacation is?" Tonio marveled. He seemed eager to make the most of the vacation and tried not to miss a single moment or skirt. Dante shook his head and smiled. He was very grateful to his friend and wanted him to enjoy the rest he deserved, as a hard-working surgeon could easily be overwhelmed by stress without regular breaks. They spent 2 days in Minorca, swimming, sightseeing, and even managed to unpack their first pack of hangover pills. Then they headed to the village mentioned in the property documents. Dante felt a joyful excitement as the unusually quiet taxi driver brought them to the village and the now familiar streets. Dante remembered them, and with that, the once-forgotten headache returned. He rubbed his temples before pushing open the gate and looked around. The garden was overgrown, the house old, but it still felt like someone was keeping an eye on his property. Dante walked through the property, peered into the gazebo. He ran his hand along the wooden railings, smiled, remembering how he had built this gazebo himself. Here he learned to use the axe, and here his fingers traced the unevenness, the circular saw. The air was filled with the scent of flowers. Dante glanced at the summer house, and his heart ached, but it was just as dark as the large house he was heading toward. His hand reached under the doormat, and indeed, the key was there. Dante nervously laughed. "I hope I'm the only one who found it, and there isn't a pair of relaxed thieves sleeping in the house," he thought. With that in mind, Dante turned the key and entered the small house, looking around the hallway, examining the kitchen, sitting in a chair, checking that the TV was in place and the furniture was dust-free. A vague image of a girl he had seen here near the stove, on the couch, at the table flashed in his memory. His temples tightened again, and he reached for the medicine cabinet out of habit, finding water in the tap. Well, came Tonio's surprised voice. "You've already found both the key and the medicine cabinet?" "My memory is gradually returning," Dante nodded absent-mindedly. "And your head still hurts?" His friend frowned. "No, not as much as before," Dante reassured him. "Just feeling anxious, don't know why." He walked to the window and fell silent, scanning the windows of the summer house, but it was still empty. "All right," his friend sighed. "While you're lost in nostalgia, I'm going to take a swim and scout the surroundings." Dante forced himself to shake off the melancholy and even smiled. "Wait for me. I wouldn't mind getting some fresh air too." They quickly got ready. Dante habitually locked the door and placed the key under the mat, smoothing it out carefully. They walked a few streets and arrived at the beach. A gentle breeze blew from the sea. The sun shone brightly, and people strolled about, enjoying the weather. Dante had already plunged into the warm seawater and was lounging on a sunbed, watching as Tonio tried to chat up a couple of attractive girls. Suddenly, a bright, inflatable ball with a bell inside flew towards him. A little child, looking no older than 2, ran up and grabbed the ball with both hands. The child frowned because the uncle was holding the ball and looked up with puzzled eyes. Dante, who wanted to play ball with the child, froze, staring into the child's bright blue eyes. Just like Giovanna's. His head began to throb even more as he heard a familiar voice and saw her. His beloved was staring at him with her mouth open, while Dante struggled with the tightening pain in his head. At that moment, Tonio, surrounded by girls on either side, approached them. Giovanna glanced at them, then furrowed her brow, shot a fierce look at Dante, and, picking up the child and the ball, walked away from the beach. Dante stood in shock, alternating his gaze between Tonio with the girls and Giovanna's retreating back, before suddenly running after her, massaging his temples with his hands. "Giovanna, Giovanna, wait." "What?" she shouted, turning around, which made the child cry loudly, and she began to calm him down with tears in her eyes. Dante approached the girl. "Whose child is this? Is that all you want to ask me?" Giovanna laughed nervously. "Don't come near either him or me. Got it?" She hugged the child and walked away. Dante regretted not bringing headache pills with him to the beach. He just couldn't talk to her properly right now because his consciousness was literally drifting away, and he couldn't focus on any one thought. His mind was a complete mess. All the memories surged in at once. He felt so terrible that his legs felt like they wouldn't hold him. Tonio understood his state, said a hasty goodbye to the girls, and quickly got his friend home. "I'm thinking," Tonio mused. "Should I give you cognac or a pill? The doctor would give you a pill, but I'm your friend, so I suggest you drink. After all, finding your son and wife on the beach is quite a twist." Tonio sat down and poured cognac into a glass. "What son?" Dante snapped. "I've been gone for 2 years. She's probably already remarried, and not to me. She probably didn't suffer for long and didn't search too hard." Dante's words sounded bitter, and Tonio laughed heartily. "Are you serious right now? Well, I'll cut you some slack since you recently cracked your head pretty hard. But you haven't forgotten basic math. What does math have to do with this?" Dante grumbled, sticking his head under the cold water tap, drying off, and pouring himself a glass of cognac. They clinked their glasses and drank in one gulp. "Lemon would be nice," Tonio muttered. "Anyway, listen to the math lesson from the great surgeon Belov. When you left, your girlfriend was probably already pregnant, because the child is definitely around 1.5 years old. My little sister had 3 such tots, so I've learned to estimate their age by eye. And?" Dante couldn't hold back, taking a lemon from the fridge. "And the fact is, by age, that's your son. Unless, of course, she was cheating on you. Giovanna couldn't." "She's an honorable girl." Dante suddenly got angry, and Tonio poured him more cognac. "Don't get worked up." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Tonio agreed. "But most importantly, that boy looks just like you." Even the girls from the beach noticed it. Dante froze, then broke into a smile. "Really looks like me? You're really getting sentimental," Tonio laughed good-naturedly. "Yes, he looks like you. As for your girl, or wife, I guess." "Wife," Dante said firmly, and hiccuped. She's really upset with you, and you need to think about how to fix it. Dante jumped up and prepared to leave. I'm going to see her right now and explain everything. He swayed slightly from the alcohol, and Tonio caught him. No way, Hero Dad. First, sleep it off, then go. And you need to act carefully and thoughtfully. I think she's in such a state right now that she might just hit you with a rolling pin, and you shouldn't be hit on the head. That's coming from me as a doctor. Dante agreed, but the next day he found himself standing in front of Giovanna's house. Well, their house with the stepfather. Dante was wearing a white shirt and a blazer, holding flowers. He was very nervous and wouldn't have had the courage to knock on the door if it weren't for Tonio's impatient voice. Well, how long are you going to dither, Dad? His friend stepped forward, knocked, and loudly called for the owners. At first, they heard the patter of tiny feet, and then the door was opened. Giovanna silently looked at the men. Good afternoon, Tonio said. I'm Dante's friend and his doctor. Doctor? Giovanna was surprised. Tonio sensed the girl's soft spot. Apparently, she still cared for Dante and was worried about him. Doctor, he said emphatically, I've brought his entire medical history. What illness? Giovanna paled and led the men into a modest living room. The little boy spun around nearby, playing with a colorful ball again. Tonio handed over the medical history, which they had brought from Madrid in case Dante decided to stay in the village or suddenly felt unwell. Giovanna skimmed through the documents. Accident, clinical death, coma, amnesia. Dante, oh God. She threw herself around his neck, and Dante exhaled, feeling the tension leave him. It's all right now. Really, really. Just don't cry. Giovanna hugged him tightly and mumbled something to herself, while Dante smiled warmly, feeling the sadness lift. The little boy looked at his parents, unsure whether to cry or laugh. Tonio sensed the mood and picked up the child, carrying him into the garden. Let's go, little one, let's play with the ball. Let your mom and dad talk to each other alone. Dad? The boy repeated, surprised. Dad, Tonio repeated with pride, tousling the boy's light hair.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.